Nowadays, the name GNOME doesn't have any deeper meaning, but you've probably heard before that at one point it was an acronym, that being GNU Network Object Model Environment. This name was in use way back when the project very first started. Back in 1997, the GNOME Desktop Project, GNU Network Object Model Environment. We want to develop a free and complete set of user-friendly applications and desktop tools, similar to CDE and KDE, but based entirely on free software. This was back during the days where a lot of people didn't like KDE because Qt at the time was a completely proprietary library. Since then, all of that has been dealt with, but a lot of people were concerned at the time. Now, the name is a reference to another project, a project from Microsoft, Microsoft's Object Linking and Embedding. However, GNU being in the name of GNOME wasn't just a name, and wasn't just in reference to the fact that it was built using GTK. Let's take a look at this section. Under what license does the GNOME fall? As most GNU software, GNOME application code will be released under the GNU GPL. GNOME-specific libraries will be released under the terms of the GNU LGPL. The important part being this right here, as most GNU software. Back in its heyday, both GTK and GNOME were under the GNU banner. They were GNU projects. A very long time ago, GNOME very proudly stated this fact. Freedom and community go hand in hand in GNOME. The project software is free to download, modify, and redistribute. Its communication channels and development infrastructure are visible to all. It is this freedom and openness that enables the GNOME community to exist by allowing new contributors to take part and enabling companies to collaborate in the production of mutually beneficial technologies. GNOME is proud to be a part of the GNU project. And the GNU website did the exact same thing. If we search for GTK, this one right here, and also GNOME, there we go. Now, it's not like GNU controlled the project. They had their own management, they had their own development, they were doing their own things. Since 2001, the GNOME Foundation has been its own entity. But they acted like partners, so if one of them was doing a fundraising campaign, the other one might advertise it. If GNU was trying to get new members for the FSF, GNOME would be like, hey, if you're a supporter of GNOME and you want to support free software, go join the FSF as well. Basically just trying to help each other out. You know, just acting like friendly neighbors in the free software world, because everybody here is just trying to make better software, so there's no point trying to argue with each other and compete with each other. Everybody is just trying to make computing better. Now, there's a reason why I was saying things like they were partners. Nowadays, they are definitely not partners, and that has not been the case for a very, very long time. But a lot of people up until fairly recently didn't even realize the two organizations had split. And a bit later, it'll be very, very clear why some users were just completely unaware of the split. Now, I can't speak for today, but at least back at this time, GNOME was the desktop that Stallman ran as well. As was asked in a 2007 interview, on the same page, you also stated that you use the GNOME desktop environment. What are your thoughts on other popular desktop environments such as Enlightenment, KDE, and XFCE? I chose GNOME because it's the GNU desktop. KDE is also a free desktop. At this point, the whole licensing stuff with Qt had already been dealt with. I have never used it, but now that it's free software, I have nothing against it. I am not familiar with Enlightenment or XFCE. Now, all of us have probably read at least an email or two from Stallman. He is very, very hard-headed about free software. Free software is the correct way to do things, and as such, there were tensions bubbling up for quite a while before they eventually exploded about something really, really stupid. About a website called Planet GNOME. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, Planet GNOME is basically a GNOME news aggregator site. It just collects everything GNOME and dumps it into this one location. It is a great service if you want to find out what's actually going on in the GNOME world. Now, at the time, there was a lot of discussion over what should actually be included. Obviously, something specifically about GNOME should be included, and third-party applications made for GNOME should be included. But what if it's maybe like a proprietary application that uses GNOME libraries? Does that really fit? This very simple problem exploded into a giant thread. Now, the thread went in 1,000 different directions, so we're just going to focus on the one thing that matters here. Now, it all started off completely reasonably. Hey, let's try to not have stories full of vulgar language and pornography on Planet GNOME. There's nothing inherently wrong with those things, but for something that is aggregating GNOME news, it just feels really out of place. And the second concern was also very reasonable. Let's be honest too, there are a bunch of people who used to be active GNOME members who changed their focus to other projects and who are still in Planet GNOME for no reason. Maybe Planet GNOME editors should start cleaning the old craft, no offense intended. So if you used to be involved and now you're doing KDE stuff, for example, that doesn't really fit with what Planet GNOME is. There are people who have left the GNOME community working on products that don't use any GNOME technology, posting blog posts and ads for said product on Planet GNOME. Fair enough, get rid of that as well. Then on December 9th, Stallman showed up. I wonder whether these products are free software. If not, they certainly shouldn't promote them on Planet GNOME. To which Philip Van Hoof replied, nonsense. The people who work at VMware, which is one of the companies that was appearing on Planet GNOME, also very often posted and still post about their work and appear on Planet GNOME. There's nothing wrong with that. Same goes for Nokia and other companies involved. Forbidding those contributors to talk about their work goes directly and philosophically against the Planet GNOME is a window into the world, work, and lives of GNOME hackers and contributors slogan of the project. You see that word work there, right? Even at this point, some people got very, very snarky with Stallman. As I said, tensions were bubbling up over many years at this point. To which another contributor responded, I wonder if there's a misunderstanding here. No one said that companies shouldn't be allowed to post. Richard said that Planet GNOME shouldn't be used to promote non-free software, i.e. software that denies freedom by withholding source code or withholding permission to use, modify, and distribute. This means some software from Nokia shouldn't be promoted on Planet GNOME, but Nokia, like many other companies, also develops and distributes lots of free software. No one's objecting to promoting Nokia's work on free software for GNOME. Philip replied again, that's why I wrote talk about their work. There's no misunderstanding. Mentioning that they are using some piece of LGPL software to build a closed source component is fine. Personally, I most definitely want to know about such things. And the greatest line I have ever seen written down, if GNOME wants to be relevant, it must not boycott reality. Stallman also took issue with promoting Mono. Someone said, Mono is free software according to the FSF definition. To which Stallman said, yes it is. There's nothing wrong with Mono itself. What we need to be careful of is depending on C#, linking to an article called Don't Depend on Mono. If you want to read this for yourself, I'll leave it linked down below. But VMware was still the main focus. They should not do this, as in, they should not promote it, unless VMware becomes free software. GNOME should not provide proprietary software developers with a platform to present non-free software as a good or legitimate thing. Perhaps the statement of Planet GNOME's philosophy should be interpreted differently. It should not invite people to talk about their proprietary software projects just because they are also GNOME contributors. Stallman also said GNOME is part of the GNU project and it ought to support the free software movement. The most minimal support for the free software movement is to refrain from going directly against it, that is, to avoid presenting proprietary software as legitimate. And things really broke down with Philip's next response. I understand your position. I think you might not understand the position of a lot of GNOME Foundation members and contributors. Their position isn't necessarily compatible with your position that GNOME should avoid presenting proprietary software as legitimate. The way I see it is that most members want GNOME to stay out of that philosophic discussion, although GNOME usually advises to work upstream and to do things open source when possible, as much as possible. This is just a personal point of view, of course. You, as one of the key FSF people, appear to be keen on enforcing a strict policy on how GNU's member projects should behave. So, I propose a vote on GNOME's membership to the GNU project. Let's first get a consensus from our members on GNOME status as being or not being a well-behaving GNU project or having its own identity. And finally, one of the GNOME creators hopped in as well. GNOME supports both the free software movement as well as proprietary developers, and that is why GNOME for years has encouraged the use of the LGPL license for all of its libraries. GNOME is a general purpose desktop, but it also recognizes the need for proprietary applications to use these libraries and to build and integrate properly with it. Now, not too long after this, it was made very, very clear GNOME was an acronym. GNOME is not anymore. GNOME is just GNOME. It is not GNU Model Object Environment. At this point, a line in the sand was drawn, but they hadn't publicly split, so people who knew that GNOME was a part of the GNU project basically just assumed they were for a long time into the future. In fact, it took until 2019 for GNOME to make it very, very clear this was no longer the case. I asked as executive director for GNOME to remove us from that page multiple times. They have refused to do so. Following this, Neil put out a blog post titled GNOME Relationship with GNU and the FSF. This also got cross-posted over on the GNOME discourse as well. This was around the time that some emails came out with Stallman talking about Epstein, which I'm not even going to get into here. And at the time, GNU still didn't remove GNOME from their list of applications. So in 2021, GNOME put out this tweet. Let's also clarify here, GNOME is not a GNU project. With the Internet Detective saying things like, "Oh really? Look, GNOME's on the list of GNU applications, so is GTK." If you manage to get the GNU project to stop listing those, I guess you become a hero in the GNOME circles. They have been trying for more than a year and never got any answer. And finally, after this happened, things actually got removed. Following this, GNOME and GTK documentation was being updated to remove any reference to them currently being a GNU project. Except for one place, where I guess nobody updated it, because it still says GNU's project GNOME Desktop. This is on gtk.org/about. I don't know who to contact to fix this. Once again, GNOME is not a GNU project today, but when it first started, it was and it is still a very important part of the project's history. So hopefully, you learned something today. So let me know your thoughts in the comments section down below. Did you know about this? Were you involved in GNOME back in those early days? I would love to know. So if you liked the video, go like the video. And if you really liked the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, Scribes, LiberaPay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and good night.
Like this.